Thank you, Emily, for reading. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this journey through the book of Ruth. We started this last week, where we had a look at the whole first chapter of Ruth's story, and we discovered that actually we saw that some of the choices that we make have real, genuine impact, and what we do matters. And actually, the choice that Orpah made to leave Naomi and Ruth's choice to cling to Naomi were really significant, and their lives play out as a result of that. And we reflected on some of the themes that we were going to see throughout the book of Ruth, and we'll see some more of those over the course of the next couple of weeks, and we're going to see one of them today. We talked last week a little about the providence of God, about God's unseen hand at work in this book. And actually that's what we're going to see today, I hope, if I do my job properly, that in this chapter of Ruth, that actually the unseen hand of God is firmly at work. And in some ways, well, actually, before I get to that, I've skipped down my notes there. I won't do that. We're going to see three things today. We're going to talk about the providence of God. We're going to talk about how that works out in the law. And then we're going to talk about how that works out in his people. The unseen hand of God at work. So the unseen hand of God at work in his providence. Depending on the translation you're using, chapter 2, verse 3 says either it happened to be, or as it turned out, she went to glean in the field of Boaz. And in some way, the whole story of Ruth turns on those few words. That by happenstance, by circumstance, by accident, she ends up in the field of Boaz. Except I think the Bible's kind of winking at us just a little bit as it writes, as it turned out, or as it happened. You can kind of see the writer going, just a wee accident there, are you paying attention? It's like, I don't know, do we have any Line of Duty fans in the room? So there's a couple there. Any on screen? Hands up if you're a Line of Duty fan. We've got one or two, okay. So I mean, this is up there with tapping the table 4 times, or any of the other things you've seen going on. This is a proper nod and a wink, like it just so happened. For those of you who are not Line of Duty fans, you're probably going to think I'm crazy, but it makes sense for those of you who are. There's a proper nod and a wink here. And we believe profoundly that somehow, mysteriously, and please hold the mystery of this, because it is not the case that we can explain this away. God has led Ruth to that particular field at that particular moment. And all through the Bible we see this to be true. We could look in the book of Esther, where God isn't even mentioned, and yet the story of Esther is one of the key festivals in the Jewish faith, because they saw God at work, the unseen hand of God. We see it in the story of David and Saul, the Israelites in the conquest, the Israelites in the wilderness. Pretty much anywhere you see the Israelites, you see God's unseen hand. We see it through the story of the judges often. Indeed, I think one of the most remarkable things I realized this week as I was writing this sermon is that in the New Testament, the difference is that God is incredibly visible. That's one of the things about the New Testament that makes it so remarkably different, is that it's not the unseen hand of God, but the very visible hand of God, both in the sense of the life of Jesus, but also by the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit through his church. The Bible is clear that God is involved in all sorts of aspects of life, from little things, where we see him talking about that if he cares for the sparrow, how much more for us? And also in the huge, big things of nations and of the whole of the story of the people of Israel. Now, that doesn't make us robots, somehow walking around with no autonomy, no free choice. 2 minutes in the Bible shows you that God has allowed us to choose, and all too often humanity has chosen evil rather than good. That's part of the story that we know. But we also must see a God who's involved, intimately involved. And so we refer to that as God's providence, God at work in ways that we can't see, involved in profound ways, but that at times can often seem small. In this case, small because Ruth could presumably have gone to any number of fields to glean, but instead she went to Boaz's field. And as we read the rest of the story, or if you know the rest of the story, then you'll know fine well that that is a critical turning point in our story. So the first thing, God's unseen hand in the circumstances of life, his providence at work. But the second is the law. Now, I don't know how many of you heard that read or have read it before and went immediately, the law is the profound thing here. And how many of us, even if we did, we would think of the law as good news? Right? That's often a challenge for us. The law, we are told by Paul, one of the purposes of the law is to allow us to see that we are sinners. That doesn't feel like good news. And Paul, again, is quite explicit in Romans that it's not good news for us. The good news is Jesus. But here we see that the law is good news. Why is that? Let me read to you from the book of Leviticus. Not a book that I quote that often, to be fair, which might be my problem rather than anything else, but Leviticus chapter 19. This is in the midst of the whole of Leviticus 19, 18 and 19 are these strange, not strange, but just list of rules. Some of them that make perfect sense to us, others not so much. But listen to this. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. We could just preach on that, right? It's incredibly beautiful. God, big long list of things. Do not steal, do not lie, don't defraud or rob your neighbor, all of these kind of things. But right in the middle of that, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. The law was good news to the outsider. The law was good news to the impoverished. And the reason the law was good news to the poor and to the outsider is because it reflected the character of God. And God is good news for the outsider and the impoverished. God's law makes space for those who are left outside. God's law makes space for those who are destitute. And that's exactly the situation that Naomi and Ruth find themselves in. Ruth is the outsider. She's the Moabite. The Moabites have been told they could never, ever be part of the people of God. Well, not never, ever. I think 10 generations it says that they couldn't be part of the people of God. She's an outsider. Naomi, she's impoverished. All the men who could provide for her have died. She's left on her own. And yet, she's not on her own because God is at work. His unseen hand is at work in the law that he gave to his people. God's goodness is reflected in the law. Friends, we would do well to remember that. Lewis preached for us a couple of weeks ago from the book of Nehemiah. If you didn't hear that sermon, I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to it. It was, I think, prophetic. I don't use that word lightly. It was prophetic in the best sense of calling us to Jesus and provoking us at the same time. And the sermon itself is worth your time, so just do that. But he used two examples at the end, which I know were provocative because I've had the emails to prove it. But he used the examples of abortion and of those who were being impoverished throughout this pandemic. Friends, as Christians, and this is not a political statement in any way at all, God told them not to harvest right to the edge of the fields, so that the traveller going past, the outsider, the foreigner, the impoverished, would be able to walk by the field and pick the grain and eat it. Do you remember Jesus and his disciples are out walking one Sabbath, and they reach out and they take corn from the edge of the field? They're accused of breaking the Sabbath. They're not accused of stealing, because the field was left like that to provide for those who didn't have. Friends, we must take that really seriously, that God has put in his law, and it has continued to be a pattern that he's called his people to take care of those who are impoverished. We must remember that. One of the key things I think we see in this whole book of Ruth, we're going to see about redemption in a couple of weeks. We're going to see about what it is to be a person of good character and to behave in the right way. But it comes back to the reason that Ruth could even go and feed her and Naomi was because God in his law had said, we're going to take care of the outsider and the impoverished. And there's bits of the Bible where you read and you go, like I don't like the conquest narratives where they're told to go and slaughter a whole village, or even Nehemiah that Lewis spoke from, where there's this sense of us and them that can be really jarring, particularly to our modern ear. But I think we must always remember that underneath that, there's always this thread where God was saying, care for the poor, care for the widow, care for the outsider, care for the foreigner. Those have always been the things that God cared about. And we must care too. God's goodness and his unseen hand is seen in the law. Last point. God's unseen hand is found in his people. Boaz acts in a manner in keeping with the law. I am sure there were those in Israel who harvested right to the edge of their fields, who sent behind a second set of, behind the first set of threshers, they sent another set so that they didn't miss anything, because there have always been greedy people. But Boaz is not like that. Boaz acts in a manner in keeping with the law. In fact, we see in verses 15 and 16 and beyond, but in those verses we see that he goes far beyond what the law required. In verses 15 and 16, it says this, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. So first of all, he's saying she can go and pick stuff out of what they have harvested, not just what's left on the ground. And then he says this, even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles. In other words, don't make it hard for her. Give her something from our harvest and leave them for her to pick her up, and do not rebuke her. He goes beyond that. And I think in Boaz we see something profound of the character of God. Generosity, just as we've read, but also when it comes time for her to eat in the break, he makes sure that she has more than she needs. In fact, when she goes home with an ephah of threshed barley, that's a huge amount for one woman. It would have fed a number of families typically. So he's generous, he's kind. We see the kindness that he extends to her. He's observant. He notices that there's a new woman coming along beside his servants. And he's protective. I don't know if you picked it up in the reading, but he reflects that protective character of God when he makes sure that she's not going to be harmed. Me Too is a real thing today, but it was back then too. The fields and the threshing floor were not a safe space for a single woman. But Boaz makes it so, because he's reflecting something of the character of God: generosity, kindness, observance, and being protective. And I think the greatest witness to God's reality, the greatest way that people get to see the unseen hand of God, is through his people. Ruth experiences the goodness of Israel's God because Boaz expresses the goodness of Israel's God in his behavior. How many of us who've come to faith can point to someone and say the shape of their life showed me something of the reality of God? Anyone? Is it some of us? Yeah. We've seen people who show us what God looks like. We might be able to read about it in the Bible. The Holy Spirit might impress it on our hearts, and we need both of those things. But we need to be able to tangibly see what this God looks like, and we see it in people's lives. And I know in my own life, when I became a Christian, I had a friend Rachel and a friend Finlay, and they both showed me something of what it meant to follow God, of what this God that they spoke about looked like. And it was very personal to me. It was the things that mattered to me that they were able to express that was like. And then eventually I got the opportunity to hang about with a community of Christians. And they were weird. Right? They were weird. They were just the most different group of people ever. And I'll never forget going 10-pin bowling. How very Christian. Going 10-pin bowling with this group of guys, most of whom I didn't know, and who were all very different. There were some cool guys, and there were some nerdy blokes, and there was a difference in age, and there was just lots of differences, loads of things that they shouldn't have had anything in common. And yet, the couple of hours I spent with them, I was astonished at the way they related to one another, the care they had for one another, the compassion they had for one another, the fun they had together, the joy that there was in their relationships. And it was abundantly clear to me, even as a complete heathen, that they had something I had never seen before. That their relationships together and the way that they were behaving was reflecting something of the character of this God that they claimed was real. That was one of the most significant experiences for me in coming to faith. Friends, we get to be that signpost for other people. The joy for us is we get to be like Boaz. We get to be someone who, we don't need to be the greatest preacher in the history of the world. We don't have to be somebody who knows exactly how to tell the full gospel to everybody all of the time. We just need to have lives that are shaped by the character of God and reflect something of that to people so that they can see it. And in Boaz, we saw generosity, we saw kindness, we saw that he was observant, that he was protective. We could add in there that he was hospitable. There's a bunch of others. There's loads. Anything you see in the character of God that you can cultivate in your life will be a way of allowing the unseen hand of God to be seen by those who don't know him. So, God's unseen hand is seen in the circumstances of life. God's unseen hand is seen in the law. God's unseen hand is profoundly seen in the lives of his people. Friends, brothers and sisters, let us be a people like Boaz who live our lives in such a way as to be revealing God's unseen hand so that others can benefit, just like Ruth benefited from the fact that Boaz was shaping his life according to God's ways.